Good evening. Let me present Dr. Albert Hurwit. Now, that's Dr. Hurwit, but usually when we're talking to musicians, doctor means DMA or DPhil or one of those things, but you're a real one.
Real physician.
So, you'll forgive me for putting it like this, but you're not even a musician. So, why did you turn into a composer?
When I was 55 years old, which was a few years ago, music started to swell within my head. I had always played around with music in a very amateurish way. My music education consists of 3 years as a poor piano student. But I had always composed using number systems and graphic systems. But at about the age of 55 or so, I would wake up at night, and instead of thinking about my practice or the patients, there'd be music in my head. And I started to play around with it, and the more I did, the more I was encouraged by professionals, and decided to be a part-time physician, part-time composer, which was a mistake because I was far too compulsive of a physician to be part-time. So I tried for several months as a full-time composer, and that was the decision. But to this very day, I miss practicing medicine. I love practicing medicine, and it was a difficult decision, and thanks to people like you and the Columbia Orchestra, it's at least been partially successful.
So what was the music that interested you before you took this huge step in your life? What sort of music did you listen to?
Not much. I was never, the main exposure I had to classical music was when I was a kid, 10 or 12 years old. My father had a hardware store, and I would go in and do the most menial work, inventory in the basement, and he'd pay me a few bucks, and at some point, someone had dropped off a series of 78 classical music records, and he would give me those albums. And for a period of 3 or 4 years, I really did listen to those a lot, and that's probably my main music exposure. The usual, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, etc. In trying to write a symphony, when I started, I didn't know much about the structure of a symphony at all. And while I had my mentor, Michael Lancaster, who offered to work with me, he was the conductor of the Hartford Symphony Orchestra, and by sheer serendipity, he heard a tape I had made of a 6-minute piece and elected, I didn't know him at that time, but elected to give it a world premiere at the Bushnell Theater in Hartford. And on the basis of that, we developed a relationship. And he is one who was my mentor and would say, here are the usual four movements of a symphony, and in general what you do. But that wasn't good enough for me. I needed some structure. The symphony is 59 minutes long, and as you well know, it has to be like a legal argument. It has to continue in a musically logical manner. And what I used as a structure was my family history, because just at that time, there was a huge family reunion of 150 or more people, and I was heading it up in a way. And I did some research into the family history, and there before me was the structure of a symphony, my family. And their history of first the diaspora across Europe as the Jews were being persecuted, and that's called Origins, the first movement. The second movement, Separation, and that's where in around 1900, because of persecution with the pogroms in Russia, the family elders told the younger generation, my grandfather and my mother, you must go and you must leave here for reasons of safety, and all the parties knowing they'd never see each other again, which was the case. The third movement, which we'll hear tonight, is entitled Remembrance, and that's the name of the symphony as well. and probably doubly named because I think that's the heart of the symphony. And the Remembrance is the tearing apart of this family and the feelings that one would have. And yet, I think you'll hear a second theme coming in, which, while sad, is also an affirmation that the family will live. And the fourth movement is arrival. It starts with the ship going from Amsterdam across into Ellis Island, and the family finally achieving freedom and liberty in the United States. I don't want to win any races. All I know is that this is what I feel. I don't compose intellectually or because the rules say I'm supposed to do such and such. I compose for good or for bad, from what I feel. And what I feel is not I'm not trying to be critical, but it's not atonal music. It's not cutting edge music, and I make no pretense that it is. It's me.
So you don't bring the scientific attitudes from one profession into the other?
You know, this is often asked, and isn't there a correlation of physicians and mathematics and music? There may be a weak one, but when I was a physician, my discipline was to be absolutely rational, unemotional. When one's making a diagnosis, you think of nothing but assimilating the facts and coming up with the best answer you can without any emotion, without any, it's just totally rational. Composing is delightful for me in a way because it's the exact opposite. I compose totally emotionally and unintellectually, irrationally, and I don't care if I'm breaking rules. I put my heart into it, and then it goes through the brain. That's the filter, but only after it comes from the heart. And I think there's a very fundamental difference between the two.
Paradoxically, you're using this very technical means to write this very emotional music.
That's right, but only as a tool. It's very easy, and we've heard this, it's very easy for somebody to get on what I have and what hundreds and thousands of other people have and hit 10 notes and a few chords and tell the computer, compose it like Mozart would or like Beethoven would. And very often, it's tempting for me to let it take over, but it's my slave, and it's always going to be my slave. I have the advantage and the disadvantage of sometimes going down roads or paths where someone trained in music would say, don't do that, there's no resolution. And they're very often right. I've hit a lot of brick walls after hours of work, whereas if I were trained, I would know that's not going to result in anything. But once in a while, I think I go down a path that a trained composer wouldn't, and it turns out to be not bad. I needed some structure, so when I'd wake up in the morning, where did I come from and where am I going? Most trained musicians know. They know when they're supposed to change keys and when something's getting boring and they have to make variations. I don't have that background. And I found that by just as a general picture, keeping that as kind of a superstructure, it would help guide me and also stimulate me. In the second movement, I've explained, the family is forced to separate. And I'm sitting with the third movement. I already had the initial theme, which I had composed many years before. But I wanted to express these deep emotions of a family being torn apart. And I imagined myself as my great-great-grandfather in a small farming village in Russia said to his children and grandchildren, look it, time has come, we have to separate and we'll never see each other again. Now, some of my children are here and grandchildren. How would I feel if I had to say to them? And at that point, it's like going to the moon. You're going to the moon for your safety, and I'll never see each other again. One doesn't have to be much of a creative artist to start to feel a lot of emotion there. And I think that helped me put my emotion into music.
But you have your story to tell us, and we'll be listening to it this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hurwit.